going to go ahead and get started, everyone. My name is Kim Miller. I'm the assistant manager here at the Apalachicola Reserve, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's session entitled Coastal Restoration. So up first, we have Dr. Jyotismita. Did I get it right? It's Taye. She's with the University of Central Florida, postdoctoral researcher, and her presentation is Reefense, Advancing Coastal Defense Through Engineered Oyster Reefs in East Bay and the Florida Panhandle. So welcome. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jyotismita Taye. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in University of Central Florida. So my presentation today is about the Reefense project that is going on at the Tyndall Air Force Base, which is cited as the Baker Point. So I will take you through this phase one journey that we have just completed recently. So this Reefense program includes like 50 people from these universities and organizations that are working on across various aspects of the project. So the program Reefense is funded by DARPA, the Biological Technological Offices, and the main objective of the program is to develop a self-healing hybrid biological and engineered reef mimicking structures to mitigate the coastal erosion. So the PI of the project is Professor David Bushak from Rutgers University. Our program calls Mosaic Oyster Habitat, which is MOH for coastal defense. So the technical areas in this program are the four main technical areas that the whole team is working on. Is about the reef structures, the ecosystem engineering, the adaptive biology, and the techno-economic assessment. So moving forward, what is a mosaic oyster habitat? So the habitat are that come together from different parts of the ecosystem. They closely work to create a place for the biodiversity to flourish. And so our concept is not novel, but it is something which is like an affordable solution for the ecosystem to flourish. So it should be economical and also effective and resilient. So these are the 6 components we have here. Our first is the low carbon concrete, which the reef will be built of, and it also has to be biodegradable. And we are combining these materials to create a micro scale structures which enhances the equipment, and also it will deter predation. And this micro scale will be combined into macro scale, and it will design so that the wave attenuation occurs. And also the oysters that we are recruiting in this mosaic, in these reef structures will be selectively bred oysters so that they are maximize the design. And also there will be other habitats like vegetation, mussels, so that we create this mosaic habitat to stabilize the erosion. So this is a primary, the timeline of the program. So we have just completed the phase 1 in November, and we are in phase 2 now, but what I will show you here is mostly about the phase 2 that we have just completed. Some of the metrics that we have completed in phase 1 are like wave attenuation testing, creating good breed of oyster by various teams, and also about the techno-economic assessment. So the project site is at the Tyndall Air Force Base, and the name of the site is like the Baker Point, which you can see in the lower figure. So the aim of the project is not to protect the base overall, but rather to work at this site so that we can develop methods that may prove beneficial as the base is rebuilding to improve resiliency. So what are these materials we're working on? These are like low carbon concrete materials and biodegradable concrete. This has been looked after by Rutgers and the University of Melbourne. So the materials are tested for various properties, the mechanical, physical, chemical, durability, and all. And so the biodegradability can be achieved by using some novel materials, and so it will persist through time, and it will degrade after 15 to 20 years so that the material get enough time to develop. So this design has been like an inspiration to be taken from the natural habitat, right? So we went to this mosquito lagoon in Florida where there are intertidal oyster reefs, And we have surveyed these oyster reefs to see how this natural habitat is. So we did a basic reef bathymetry survey to know the morphology of the oyster reefs, and we also wanted to know what is the complexity of the oyster reefs. So we have also done 3D scanning of the oyster reefs to know the complexity, like canopy height, the rugosity, the fractal dimensions. And we are also carrying out hydrodynamic study in this healthy oyster reefs to know how the spatial heterogeneity around the oyster reefs, like the sparse oyster reefs or the moderate oyster reefs or the dense oyster reefs, what is the hydrodynamics around this different spatial heterogeneity. So moving forward, taking from this inspiration, there is a design team in Australia, which is who is Alex God. He is from the Reef Design Lab, and there are other teams in West Australia and Rutgers. So they are doing on this design modules. So this is a simple 5-part mold setup. So it's very simple and can be molded. So this design from the Australia is brought to Rutgers, and the Rutgers civil engineers, the concrete engineers, are molding this into the reefs. So these 3 reefs are like 3 different heights. You can see here, unit 1, unit 2, and unit 3. They are like different dimensions. And what is the goal of here is to maximize the complexity and also to optimize the ease of manufacturing, and also like how easily we can deploy in the site. These are some of the criteria that we are looking on when we are designing these reefs, so that it attenuates wave, there are habitat growth on the reefs, and also the predator refuse and stability, affordability, and practicality. Moving forward, these are like 1/10 scale and half scale modules, which we are testing in the flume and in the field. So here in the left, you can see the oyster equipment on a 1/10 scale units after flume trials. These are like very good results we are getting here, where the oysters are recruiting. And also a pilot deployment had been carried out in a half-scale module in Cape May, New Jersey by the Rutgers team. And just after a 4-month deployment, we see a growth of oysters on these reefs. So now we have the design. We have this half-scale modules. And this half-scale modules has been tested in the lab flume for this wave attenuation by the University of Western Australia. So 4 basic reef configurations were tested in this flume. So within this 4 basic configuration, there are like different layouts of this configuration being changed. And so there are like 15 different layouts had been tested overall. So targeting a 20-year return period of extreme wave in this Baker Point, this experiment was carried on, and we see that most of the design have passed through the 70% wave attenuation, and few of them have also passed the phase 2 metric, which is our 90% wave attenuation. So now we have this, since our results are very good, so we had this flexibility that we can work on the ecological benefits among this variety of designs that we have. So this is the video you can see carried out in the flume about the wave attenuation. So some of the layouts I have here, and the blue one you can see it has attenuated to 80 to 89% of wave, and the green one, 2 green ones I have here, is attenuated above 90. So our team is mostly looking for the layout 2C, where we have 3 different modules, the slope at the ends. The black one is a full height module of 60 centimeters high. The yellow, you can see the medium height module of 45, and low, it's a 30 centimeter high. So now we have the reef layout, and so we wanted to see how the oysters are recruiting on this layout. So this 1/10 scale module was experimented in a flume, annular flume, to see how these oyster spats are recruited. So this was carried out by the Rutgers team. So they have these 3 different layouts, mountain, valley, and plateau, with a control layout as a cone to see how these oysters are recruiting here. There is a result here, and we observed that this replicates where the results were replicated like 3 times, and the flow was from left to right here in this figure, and the shading, the darker shading, represents higher density of oysters. So all in these 3 layouts, like so the mountain valley and the plateau, we have higher density of oysters with compared to the control, which is the cone. So this is nothing novel here, but we wanted to see if the oysters get recruited on these materials or not. So now we have all these designs coming up together. So we are progressing through the reef designs and also the materials. So now the team is looking after the development of fast-growing disease-resistant oysters. So they are pursuing through genomic selections. I'm not a biologist, so I'm not so very familiar, but there's one slide I'm showing you. It's like they started collecting the wild oysters reef, wild oysters from Florida, and they're testing in the lab to create a population so that they create a like the best, strongest selection, and they get repeated with every generation. So the team which is associated with this biology are this LSU, Rutgers, and Auburn Shellfish Lab. So again, there are more materials which the team is looking after so that they can see if their oysters are getting recruited on these different materials. So, so, so these oysters were recruiting on all these different substrates, and this again is nothing novel here, but it was important to demonstrate that none of these mixtures have retarded settlement, and also to determine that the extent to which the structures can be textured further. So now we have everything coming together, but we have this predator, and so field observations and also like literature review has given us the knowledge that there is the Florida crown conch that may be a predator deterrence for these oysters. So there are some designs according to literature where we can have gaps from the lower ground and test for its predator. So this designs 4, 5, and 6 were deployed, and they were for 8 months they were deployed and checked for the oyster growth on them. And this 3 designs were giving us a good results where oysters were growing. We also have like a mosaic habitat, right? So we wanted to look up around the site for this, what type of vegetation growing around there. So we have vegetation and other kinds of habitats. We have aspartans, alterniflora, halodilorite, juncus, and we also have a very the team was actually surprised to see that there was a strong habitat association within the juncus and the mussels, whereas like my mussels are mostly associated with the alterniflora. So the wetland vegetation mostly consists of the spartina, the aspartans, the juncus, and the halodilorite. So the team is looking after to create the mosaic habitat, taking this vegetation into consideration. So how does our conceptual design looks like? Just for the permitting purpose, this is the conceptual design where we have the breakwater at the front, and then at the behind we have our habitat, the mosaic habitat, where we have non-plastic shellbacks and also the native vegetation that we have found around the site. This breakwater design is again in the permitting phase where we are trying to come to the conclusion about all our designs into the permitting. So again, there are these shell bags where we have high relief shell bags and low relief shell bags and medium relief, so that we attenuate the wave energy when it comes to the shoreline, and we have this vegetation around near the shoreline created by this intertidal vegetation planting, which will be mostly about what I have showed in the earlier slide about the alterniflora aspartans. This is just a layout of the breakwater reef, which is a scaled diagram of 50 meters shoreline length. So it has been proposed, and we have this manatee gaps in between these reefs so that it allows the manatees to go. And so this is a 3D layout, it's a 2D layout in the picture. This is the phase 2 metrics that we are looking to deploy in spring this year. So we have these shell bags, right? So the shell bags, we are looking for this non-plastic shell bags material. So they have been tested in the lab, and we are still looking on more options of this material so that we can include in the mosaic habitat. And this comes lastly the techno-economic assessment, which has been looking after by the University of Arizona. So the main cost comes from the larva production and the deployment and the biology. So from production, there are two things, the larva and the concrete production, but the main cost drivers come from the concrete production. So we are finding out cheaper supplies of concrete materials so that we can reduce the price. And also we are considering how to reduce the transportation. So the team is saying, like, if you transport to trains, it may be, the cost may be reduced, but we're still looking for some options how the cost can be reduced and we can meet the phase two metrics, that is the $600 per cubic meter. So there are three cost comes from the three different materials: the biodegradability, the low-cost self-consolidating concrete, and the Portland cement concrete. So we are looking for the low-cost self-consolidating concrete here, and we are hoping that we will meet the phase two metrics here. I think this is the last slide that we have. So I would like to thank the DARPA project team and also the Reefense team of like the multi-institutional, multi-departmental team that we have. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
I have a question. That last number, $600 per cubic meter, I mean, how does that compare to buying big rocks and putting them in the ocean? Any idea?
The big rocks, it would be all natural, right? But still we are looking after creating a mosaic habitat, and these are like biodegradability. The big rocks, I don't know if the oysters will recruit on the big rock because oysters recruitment is different. Yeah.
Right, but just the cost, I mean, any idea?
I don't think we have done that comparisons study, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. Thank you
you
very
so
much.
much.
Appreciate it. Okay, up next, we'll be hearing from Rick Harter. He's with Harter Restoration and Consulting, LLC. He is working with WSP and the Appalachia Regional Planning Council on the Franklin 98 Living Shoreline Project.
Thank you. Okay, everybody raise your hand if you drove on Highway 98 within the last week. Right hand, raise your right hand. Okay, everybody raise your left hand if you have to drive down Highway 98, get home. Okay, everybody raise both hands if you're having a good time today. Okay, everybody wake up, because it's afternoon and now you'll have food coma, right? Good. Okay, so we're going to talk about Franklin 98. Anybody who's heard of the project, Franklin 98? Okay, great. And it's been all good things, I hope. So the Franklin 98 project is something that has been in the works for a number of years now. In fact, I don't know if Jenna, if you remember, probably about 10 years ago, I called you and told you, I really think we need to have a living shoreline along Highway 98. And it was an out there idea. And then it took years of talking to all sorts of partners, planning, grant funding, all that. And here it is. It's finally happening. So super excited. Appalachia Regional Planning Council is the lead organization for the project. Josh was here and had to leave, so he was going to introduce and we're going to co-present. So I'll cover his piece here. But anyways, it's funded by, initially it was funded by Florida DEP to do a feasibility study. We did a number of stakeholder events right here in this room and had lots of input to look at a whole stretch of shoreline from East Point all the way to Carabel Beach. So a 12-mile section of shoreline. And since we've narrowed it down basically from Yent Bayou to the breakwater here at East Point. So about down to like 6 to 6.5 miles of potential project area. NIFWIF, as it was mentioned earlier, the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund has helped fund this, as well as the National Coastal or Emergency Coastal Resilience Fund. I don't know, is Sarah Ketron still here? There's more GBF money I hear that still needs to be spent, and we are gaining momentum on implementing this project with the hopes that we'll have more people banging on the door asking, we want this too, we want this too. And so it's taken a lot of work to get to that point, but we actually are getting to that point now where we do have property owners saying, we want this too. And so this shoreline, Highway 98 is a designated evacuation route. You can see there's all sorts of different shoreline armoring that's been put in place over the years to try to protect it. Every time there's a storm that comes through, it eats away at the road. DOT has to rebuild the road, and anyways, it's a never-ending problem, right? So the process of constantly trying to armor it some more and armor it some more is only going to go so far. And so really, our approach is to address these areas that, they've got all sorts of vertical seawalls and different generations of riprap, articulated concrete block mat. It's very expensive to keep armoring it and armoring it and armoring it. And every time you do, you're having a negative impact on the intertidal zone and the productivity that could be there. So what we're doing is building a complex of reefs using primarily rock, a tiny bit of recycled concrete, a few reef balls, and who knows, maybe other materials too. We have some flexibility in the permit, just avoiding anything plastic. And then we've got certain design criteria to make sure that we don't have any entrapment issues of wildlife and so on. As far as getting the material into place, it's pretty challenging because there are extensive seagrass beds. So we've been working around the seagrass beds. We keep a 15-foot buffer from any seagrass beds, which is way over what the state, like the Living Shoreline general permit says 3 feet, but we're going 15 feet at a minimum. So at low tide, you'll see equipment like this out there working, placing material from the shore. It's a little hard to see, but there are lay down mats under all of the equipment. Anytime that they're out there, now they're not driving directly on the mud. They're driving on these mats that are all muddy, so I can't tell they're there. And so in this case, you actually have a small excavator on one of those mats, putting rocks onto another mat, and a big excavator on one of those mats, picking them up, and so they kind of pass them to each other to get them out there. And so you'll see them working from shore. They'll also drive on top of the reefs, so we're trying to minimize the footprint of where they're driving. And we're also, they're putting in rocks and reef balls from barge. So a lot of times you won't see anything going on, even though it's the middle of the week and middle of the day. It's like, how come nobody's working? Well, it's because of the tides. We get 2 weeks out of the year where the tides are much more cooperative when we've got the full moon and the new moon. So we get the higher high tides and the lower low tides. And then some of those days where it's just not long enough period, or it doesn't get shallow enough for them to really do much work from shore, or it doesn't really get deep enough for them to do enough from a barge. So anyways, the contractors are doing a great job of being flexible and agile to take advantage of the best conditions. This is at the Franklin County School. I'll show you some maps here in just a minute. This is also the school. This picture I love. This is one of the drone flights that Will Mather. So Will, raise your hand. Will's the project manager with WSP. He's also the drone pilot for much of the imagery that we get. Look at all the waves out here, and there's not so much waves right here. That's going to enable us to get salt marsh planted in there. The Conservation Corps of the Forgotten Coast has been planting in here. Joe, I think I saw you walk in a few minutes ago. They've been getting some plants in there, Spartina alterniflora, and those are starting to take, I'd say, by the end of this growing season. we're going to have some really nice looking marsh in here behind the reefs. I was out there looking at these rocks earlier today, and at the far end is a reef. Let's see, which one of these is the laser? Is it that? Here's what's left of the school pier. Just the farthest east reef was actually hand built by Conservation Corps of the Forgotten Coast, made of recycled concrete pieces that would have otherwise gone to the landfill. They worked really hard to break those up, clean the material so that it didn't have any debris or rebar or anything in it, and they hand placed that and built that initial reef. That was the first reef to go in, and it has a lot of oysters, pretty good size oysters too, probably 1.5 inch oysters, 100% coverage on a lot of the rocks for the areas that are below the water line most of the time. Looking really good. And then the reefs from about the pier down to about here have oysters on them. And then from here to like maybe about here have oysters on them. And then the ones in the middle were put in after the spat recruitment was done for the year. So this was all like the end of like last fall. And so we're really looking forward to this spring and seeing what kind of recruitment we start getting. And I'll show you some great numbers in just a minute that show there's a lot of promise for a lot of oysters. Here's a shot of the staging area behind the East Point breakwater, where they load the barge. This is the barge that they use to haul the materials out when they're placing it. There's some of the planting that Conservation Corps folks put out. Again, at Spartina Alterniflora. This site actually was planted last summer. This is a site where there's actually pretty good wave climate already without any reefs, and there's really not any room to put reefs in there because of the seagrass beds are so close to shore. So we went ahead and did some test planting there to see how the plants would do getting established without additional wave attenuation at that specific spot. Also, we're sort of testing what's the maximum depth that we can put transplanted material in and have it still survive without drowning. Because if the marsh plants spread through rhizomes vegetatively, they'll kind of creep out to the point where they've reached their maximum depth so that they're not drowning. And we didn't know how that compares with if they're planted. Maybe they're not quite as strong. So anyways, overall they're doing really well, and this marsh is going to just like look completely awesome by the end of this growing season because there's so many new shoots coming up. Here's a photo of the greenhouse, not the greenhouse, but the nursery where they're growing this material. It's over at the that's your facility, I guess, or FWC? Yeah, okay. Okay, so here's status of phase 1, and I'll show you a map in a second that shows you the different phases. Phase 1 is 3 different sites: Franklin County School, and then Tatel State Forest. There's 2 parcels, and the reason we started with those 3 areas is because they're publicly owned, and in order to get the state permit, we need permission from the riparian property owner. The riparian interest, so whoever the property owners. And so we were able to get those public entities to sign off. So these are all green, these are all built. Again, this is the one that Conservation Corps built with the recycled concrete. All the others are rocks. This is the center site. This is actually a much bigger site. It's a different scale. And so this is Tatel State Forest. There's a parking lot like kind of right down here that goes to the trails. And what you see here is all of the reefs along the shore are constructed. The big pile of rocks with the ugly turbidity curtain draped over it right now is right there that everybody sees. That was kind of a let's just get some rocks in while the tides are adequate, and then a storm took the turbidity curtain. Anyways, the turbidity curtain is supposed to be gone yesterday, but it should be gone by tomorrow. And so now that all these are done, these other reefs that are sort of, I don't know, kind of isolated, are going to be constructed by barge. But all the shore work is done here. So the shoulder, I think the shoulder's already been repaired through most of here. I think they still have some work to do down here on repairing the shoulder. And they've already started planting there too. And then this is farther down at Taye East, is what we call it. And so same thing, you can see pretty much all of the reefs that are closest to shore, all of them that they could access from shore are constructed. I'll point out there's these two orange reefs. Those are going to be reef balls. In fact, there's another load of them going out possibly today if the wind is not too strong. And so this gives you a kind of an overview of all these sites. So here's the school. Here's Taye, the larger parcel, and the other smaller parcel east. And so the red is phase one. This greenish, tealish, bluish color are two more sections that are going to be phase two, which is in permitting right now. And so these are private property owners who said, hey, I like what you're doing there. Can I get that too? And some really great comments that I've heard. Like I was down here marking off some areas, and there was a guy who came out, and I said, I said, I guess you're wondering what we're doing out here. And he said, well, I got a pretty good idea. And he said, well, does it work? I said, well, yeah, go look at the school, and you'll see the wave attenuation, the reduction in waves. And he said, well, I tell you what, it looks really cool. So that's a big deal to me, because there've been, some of the folks in the community, they don't like it. It's change. Anything new, anything different, people are resistant to change. That's just human nature. But when people start seeing it and go, oh, that looks pretty cool, that's pretty powerful stuff. We also have some parcels that are actually farther to the west of here that we're assembling for a phase 3. So we've got a phase 3 in the works, and depending on how many more people come on in time for that, we'll submit a permit for phase 3, and it may end up being a phase 4. So the goal is from about right here to like right over here to get as much area as possible. But I will point out, we're not doing continuous reefs the whole way. We're going to have plenty of gaps so that people can go out and have cast netting and gigging for flounder or whatever. So there's a lot of gaps. Even within our sites, you can see we've got some areas where there's just plenty of access. We want to make sure that we're not inhibiting any access to the water. And so this I wanted to share. This is some data from our annual monitoring. We've got 50 transects that we monitor from East Point to Carabel, and we look at seagrass. If it's seagrass, we do Bromb, well, not Bromb K, it's a different scale, but we do percent cover, species ID, and so on. If there's marsh, we'll do a shoot count and length of the top 5 tallest shoots, I think it is. Species ID also. Oysters, we'll do oyster count and size frequency distribution. We also note predators. But this is interesting. This is from our reference sites. So we've been doing this pre-construction data collection so that we know, okay, what do we expect? What's our target? What are we trying to accomplish, and how do we know we reached our goal in terms of oyster colonization, right? If we get no oysters and the entire bay is devoid of oysters, then we don't, all we know is that we're the same as the rest of the bay. If the rest of the bay has tons of oysters and we don't have any oysters, then we know we're not doing so great. So these are our reference sites. And so what this tells us is on the on the x-axis here, this is our size classes. So these are millimeters. So, up here is basically getting close to a legal size oyster. And these are numbers of individuals per quarter square meter, which is not so big, but if you're trying to count hundreds of oysters, little tiny bit oysters in that area, you understand why we're not doing a whole square meter. So anyways, what you can see is the blue line, which is from 2020. Our peak is way down here in these tiny little oysters. So, those are like a centimeter size oyster. Average size of our oysters then was only about a centimeter. And not so many, really. 2021, our peak is going down the X scale, so our average size is getting bigger. It's also broader, and it's also higher. So we're getting more oysters, and they're bigger. And then you look at 2022, they're definitely get a lot more of them, maybe a little bigger too. And then in 2023, they're definitely getting bigger. Average size, and look how broad it is. Look how broad the base on that is. So anyways, we're seeing a lot of oysters. And if you look at just what's growing on the rocks, much of the riprap out there is too high to have oysters on it. But in some places, the very toe of the revetment is down low enough that it does have oysters going on. They're completely covered. This is right in the middle of Tate's Hell East parcel. It's a log, a stick, a branch, and those are 3-inch oysters on there. It was extremely low tide. This is almost never out of the water. But I was out there one day when it was really, really low tide, and this enormous, beautiful clump of oysters. Like, wow. So give me 2 years. This is what our reefs are going to look like. And so I mentioned already that at the school we've got oysters. We were seeing them on just on some of the PVC stakes that we were marking that initial reef with. Had a whole bunch of oysters growing on it. I'll also mention there's some of these reef balls in at the school too. This is what we're seeing. If you go out there right now, you'll see this. These are 1.5-inch oysters, 100% coverage. What is that? Like probably, I don't know, 200 oysters per square meter density is my guess. Maybe not quite. At least the big, maybe not all the big ones. Anyways, it's very promising, and we're really looking forward to it. Any questions? Yes, Amy.
Hey, congratulations. It's been a long road for you to get there.
Thanks.
Geeking out on that oyster. You used some recycled concrete, a very small amount. If you had the opportunity to use more, would you, and what are the challenges to doing it?
Great question. So the question was, we used a small amount of recycled concrete. If we had the opportunity to use more, would we? And what are the challenges? And so when we put this out to bid, we actually had 2 options in there, rock or recycled concrete. Of all the bids that came in, nobody gave us a price for recycled concrete. So apparently, availability is a challenge. So other challenges that could come with it would be available of good, clean, and properly sized recycled concrete. As far as the rocks go, they're easy to get. The other big benefit from the rocks is the size that we specified for the rocks. The contractor had bigger rocks, and they're like, well, can we put these bigger rocks in? And we're like, yeah, please, because they're more stable. We like bigger rocks. And so anyways, we ended up with overall bigger rocks than we initially spec'd, which, again, from a stability standpoint, is definitely a plus. And it was better for the contractor, because it's easier for them to move one big rock than multiple smaller rocks. They'll the same. Yes?
After that, you showed the photo of the really happy oysters that are colonizing this wood and wild forest products out here with very little market for them. Has that ever been kicked around, or is there a pilot project in that in the future?
Okay, so the question, in case you didn't hear it, is that big clump of oysters that was on the wood, and the fact that there's a lot of forestry products that maybe aren't being used to the, or not to their full value or something. Is there any discussion of using that? No. And because of stability, really. We don't want to put something out that's going to move around. Yes?
For this project, have you done any wave modeling or do you plan to do?
Have we done any wave modeling for this project, or do we plan to do any wave modeling? Yes and yes. We did wave collection, like data collection, to help aid in the design. We put what's called an acoustic Doppler current profiler out that helped us calibrate the wave models, coastal engineering models that were used to identify what sort of waves we would expect, so that we can make sure that we have rocks that are big enough and a design that is sturdy enough. We also had some low-cost wave gauges, do-it-yourself ones that Dr. Nigel Temple has done a lot of work with, and Nigel's been on our team helping us with this for years. And so we did some data collection there. Now that we have reefs in place, I'm really looking forward to this summer when we do our annual monitoring. We're going to put some of those low-cost wave gauges on the windward side and the leeward side of the reef to actually measure how much wave attenuation we're getting. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Up next, we've got Kent Smith. He's Biological Administrator for FWC. Unfortunately, he can't be here today, so we've got a recorded presentation, and he is discussing the FSU Marine Lab Restoration Project. Okay, Jenna said he should be here. She believes he'll be here tomorrow. So if you have any questions for him.
Good afternoon. I appreciate everyone who was able to make it to the symposium and apologize for not making it in person due to our professional scheduling conflicts. I'd much rather be with you all than in the required boating safety training I have to attend to. My name is Kent Smith, and I administer the Marine and Estuarine subsection within our Aquatic Habitat Conservation and Restoration section at the Florida Wildlife Commission, and will be giving this presentation about the estuarine habitat enhancement work we are doing at the Florida State University Marine Laboratory with our partners at this symposium today. Becca Hatchell is the project leader, and many of you know her well, but she also is at another previously scheduled meeting. So this project is a joint habitat enhancement effort between FWC and the FSU Marine Lab, completed with funding and in partnership with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Conservation Corps, specifically Franklin's Promise. The FSU Marine Lab is located in the northwest region of Florida within the Alligator Harbor Aquatic Preserve and very close to and within the influence of the Apalachicola Bay system. The shoreline along the FSU Marine Lab waterfront is highly impacted as a result of dredging that occurred during the 1960s to create a boat basin, navigational channel, and boat ramp, critical to the research conducted at the laboratory and maintained by the Florida State University. Following additional storm damage, specifically after Hurricane Michael, the site experienced additional loss of salt marsh, oyster, and bird nesting habitats. However, as you can see by these comparative slides, a great deal of impact was made to the system, this small estuarine outflow creek canal during the construction of the Marine Lab. So before Hurricane Michael, the system was quite green, as you can see, a lot of salt marsh available in the area, but after the hurricane came through, there was quite a bit of damage, loss of marsh, movement of sediments, and redistribution of materials throughout the system and in front of the Marine Lab. This project's an ongoing enhancement restoration effort with many components that started back in 2017. The intent of the project is to augment ecosystem services of the system by improving shorebird nesting, salt marsh, and oyster reef habitat, and thereby increase shoreline resiliency. Starting with intertidal oyster reef pilot studies in 2017, different natural and biodegradable materials were tested on the western side of the property to enhance oyster reefs. In 2019, approximately a quarter acre of nesting shorebird habitat was enhanced, and in 2022, intertidal oyster reefs and salt marsh planting phases were completed to provide shoreline stabilization at the salt marsh in front of the FSU Marine Lab. The project also provides lasting opportunities for community engagement and student research focused on estuarine habitat conservation, restoration, and enhancement techniques that can be applied broadly as the region's coastline develops, which always is inevitable, it seems. This project has also been specifically recommended as a vital shoreline restoration project and coastal habitat management practice for the Apalachicola watershed within the Apalachicola River and Bay Surface Water Improvement and Management Plan, which was developed by the Northwest Florida Water Management District in 2017. FSU's Living Shoreline Restoration Site uses natural material installations for shoreline protection and to enhance those ecological functions of the estuarine habitats. Techniques such as the planting of shoreline grasses and robust shoreline protection through constructed oyster reef breakwaters provides the bulk of this project's benefits. These adaptive methods have been implemented by others throughout the region with documented long-term success. The restoration techniques provide critical feeding, nursery, and refuge habitat for a variety of ecologically and economically important fish, invertebrate, and bird species, including many federally and state-listed species. The oyster reefs also provide a hard surface for oysters to settle on and grow, improving water quality and oyster populations in the bay while promoting natural salt marsh recovery and growth. Sediment stabilization, water quality improvement, and protection from storm surge are additional benefits that will improve the health and resiliency of the coastal system and human communities. The project design and engineering plans incorporated sea level rise projections up to the year 2100, providing appropriate elevation grades to allow for the landward migration of salt marsh species and allow for the vertical migration of oysters as sea level changes. So what has been done so far? FWC and its partners were able to complete the shorebird nesting, intertidal oyster reef, and salt marsh enhancement phases to date. However, funding was not available to complete the subtidal oyster reef enhancement originally planned as part of this particular project. Shorebird nesting habitat enhancement was accomplished by removing woody vegetation, installing sill and tow logs to stabilize new sediment shell hash platforms, and also installing suitable nesting substrate in the form of oyster shell, hash, and sand. Oyster shell was crushed and mixed with sand to obtain the appropriate substrate for shorebird nesting. And you can see this in the images above on the slide. The wood was obtained on site after the cutting down of several trees. Oyster shell was crushed under weight of a roller like this, steam roller, to be able to mix with sand. And then, of course, the woody vegetation was removed from the site to create an open sand-based substrate area for shorebird nesting. A total of 12 intertidal oyster reefs were constructed with large native lime rock and set at 1.5 foot height to allow full submergence during typical high tides around the existing salt marsh in front of the marine laboratory. All construction activities were conducted from land using a long-reach excavator, and the reefs quickly recruited oysters and established a functional intertidal fouling community. Enhancing the salt marsh area required removal of an existing concrete structure, a series of pipes, and some historic dredge material that was hardened and preventing salt marsh expansion along the front of the marsh platform. clean fill material in the form of grain-appropriate sand was distributed behind the intertidal reefs along the emergent shoreline, and recontouring of substrate elevations for salt marsh expansion support was also completed before transplanting smooth cordgrass to expand this habitat's footprint. Smooth cordgrass, Sporobolus alterniflorus, was procured and planted by Franklin's Promise and a large group of volunteers. FWC contracted with Sea and Shoreline to complete the construction phases of this project, and FSU Marine Laboratory partners assisted with contract oversight and monitoring, which is still underway. Funding was provided through internal allocations by the legislature to FWC and through a coastal program and state wildlife grant secured from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've established a monitoring and adaptive management plan that covers both enhanced salt marsh and oyster monitoring efforts. Salt marsh monitoring includes assessing species composition, plant height, stem density, basal percent cover, plant health, benthic invertebrate observations, documenting other macrofauna, sediment change, site change, and bird observations. Monitoring of our intertidal oyster reefs involves measuring reef height, reef area over time, oyster density, oyster size frequency distribution, percent cover, and density of epifaunal sessile invertebrate species such as slipper snails, barnacles, mussels, and sponges. We're seeing great results so far on our intertidal oyster and salt marsh habitat enhancements. In 2022 and 2023, our oyster reef live oyster density was over 900 per square meter. We're also seeing great coverage and growth of oysters at the reefs. Oyster reef transect shows steady live oyster occurrence of an average of 42% across the entire installed reef shoreline. Resident and transient oyster reef species have also been documented using these new habitats. We've also seen positive results for the newly transplanted smooth cordgrass communities that we're monitoring. We measured expansion in 16 out of the 15 sites by September 2023. Smooth cordgrass planted in these sites in large clumps expanded quickly and now form almost contiguous meadows along the shoreline and are quickly growing to reference community plant dimensions. Our reference sites are also holding up well, and we are seeing high shorebird and coastal bird species counts in the project area, with 34 birds counted this past species of birds counted this past September. FWC identified legislatively allocated funding for our 2023-24 fiscal year to complete the final phase of this project, and that is the installation of up to 14 subtidal oyster reefs along the channel edges leading to the FSU Marine Lab Basin. Completed oyster reef installation will result in approximately a quarter acre of oyster reef habitat along the western and eastern side of the channel. Each reef will be 75 feet in length and 10 feet in width, and they'll be comprised of native lime rock at a minimum of 12 inches in diameter. As noted, these were part of the original designs and permit for this project, but were unable to be installed during the 2022 construction due to budgetary constraints. Both FDEP and Army Corps permits have been secured for the subtidal reef construction, and FWC currently is executing procurement of a construction contractor through our invitation to bid process. Construction is envisioned to be completed during the spring of 2024 during peak spring oyster spawning and spat production. As noted, oyster reefs will be constructed by an FWC contractor using large limestone aggregate. This material is chemically suitable for oyster recruitment and will provide important fish and invertebrate habitat immediately upon installation. All oyster reefs are designed to be curvilinear in shape, mimicking natural reef profiles with corridors a minimum of 5 feet in width, placed between individual reefs to facilitate water flow and movement of aquatic life. As previously mentioned as well, we have an established monitoring and adaptive management plan for these subtidal oyster reefs, and we'll be including a monitoring component for a minimum of 3 years post-construction. Metrics outlined by Baggett et al. In 2014 include reef height, reef aerial dimensions, oyster size frequency distribution, and density of epifaunal sessile invertebrate species. So lots more to come on what these reefs will provide to our estuarine communities as time goes on after construction. Again, I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to present information on this significant project in the Apalachicola Bay region. And again, I'd like to apologize for the busy professional schedules that did not allow us to present in person nor attend this symposium. But hope you all have learned a little bit more about the work we're doing with our partners at the FSU Marine Lab. A huge shout out to those partners as well, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Florida State University Marine Laboratory and their staff, and the tireless efforts of Franklin's Promise. As you know, it takes a village to build an estuarine habitat enhancement project. For any questions about this project, please contact Becca Hatchell at the email address listed on this slide. Again, thank you very much and have a great rest of the symposium. Good afternoon. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Kent. Okay, up next, we're going to hear from John Brucker. He is the Aquatic Preserve Manager for the Central Panhandle Aquatic Preserves, and he is going to be talking about St. Andrews, St. Joseph Bay Estuarine Program Seagrass Restoration. Good to go.
Thanks. All right. Just as Kim said, I am John Brucker. I'm the Central Panhandle Aquatic Preserves Manager for Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Office of Resilience. Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection. Just as some fun facts, there's 42 aquatic preserves, 3 NERS, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, the Florida Coral Program, and many other departments within the Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection, but we all work together. The Central Panhandle Aquatic Preserve Office, you can see that we share office space here, but we manage Alligator Harbor, Apalachicola Bay, St. Joseph Bay, and St. Andrews Aquatic Preserves. The Florida Seagrass Recovery Project was primarily to be focused in St. Joseph Bay to repair propeller scars, but if we did not meet our restoration goals, we would expand into St. Andrews Aquatic Preserve and or Alligator Harbor. Those areas in greens are seagrass layers or historic seagrass layers where we could target prop scars, and the picture on the right is just an up-close of the St. Joseph Bay Aquatic Preserve. So the Florida Seagrass Project, we aim to restore submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, boat prop scars in St. Joseph Bay. It was our job to ensure project design, to monitor the implementation, and then to monitor the restoration success for a 3-year period. This project focused on turtle grass, or Thalassia testudinum. In St. Joseph Bay, propeller scarring has become a big issue, and so we're trying to repair seagrass as it continues to get worse. The restoration efforts included survey and mapping of scars, as well as the development of restoration plans for each of the 3 aquatic preserves mentioned. So monitoring was going to occur, performance criteria was going to be used, and again, 3 years of monitoring. These are our performance criteria. It's a lot of it. The goal is to repair 2 linear acres, so not a 2-acre area with prop scars, but literally 2 acres at 2 acres of prop scars. The goal was to get our scars to revegetate to a score of 3 on the Baron-Blockett scale by year 2, and then a score of 4 by year 3. An education outreach component of a shallow seagrass buoy system was installed, and if we were to use any seagrass planting units to alleviate restoration, we would do survivorship of those. This is sort of our monitoring schedule for the 3 years. For those of you that don't know what propeller scarring is, scarring occurs when a boat propeller goes through a shallow seagrass area and it cuts up the roots, the stems, the leaves, and the grasses, basically creating a valley through the grass. It looks like a big scar, as it sounds like. These white ones are ones that were treated, but you get the idea. Turtle grass is very slow to respond to restoration, and if you don't sometimes give it a nudge, it is very slow to recover, or it just won't recover. As I mentioned, sometimes you have to give seagrass a nudge to help with recovery. There are plenty of examples of what you can do on the next slide, but the main goal is we want to prevent damage from getting worse. We want to restore ecosystem services, and we want to be able to create site conditions to continue to repair themselves. So as I mentioned, there are lots of different options between no treatment, transplanting or planting individuals, the use of bird stakes, where the birds help fertilize the water in a treated area. Some historic methods include sod replacement, so big chunks of seagrass being transplanted, and then sediment tubes, as you see on the bottom. Sediment tubes are a traditional use, but there are mixed opinions on the success. So the goal of sediment tubes is to bring the scars up to ambient grade with the surrounding seagrass beds. So just as I mentioned, a propeller goes through, chops it up, and creates a valley. You want to put the tubes in to create the natural ambient level, so there's a natural filling in of the grass. If you don't meet the ambient level, if you're too high or too low, it just won't grow in. If it's too low, it'll continue to scour. If it's too high, it just won't grow. So as I mentioned, a mapping component, we had to identify scars to recover. So in St. Joseph Bay and in Alligator Harbor, we used a drone, a little fixed wing plane. I say we are contractors. 10,000 acres were mapped in St. Joe, about 4,000 in Alligator Harbor. Due to weather conditions, time constraints, things like that, to map St. Andrews, we just went with a regular fixed-in aircraft and mapped about 2,300 acres. The drones were able to get us 6-inch resolution, I believe, or I'm sorry, 6-centimeter resolution with the drones and 6-inch resolution. So we got some very high-quality seagrass data. From that imagery, our contractors ran comparisons and used GIS software to identify scars. The yellow lines are trims. I'll explain that in a second. The red ones are scars. There was ground truthing done by boat mask and gear to get in the water, just verify that what they were seeing or to verify that what they thought was a scar was a scar. So a trim is where the grass is cut and shows up as a shadow, but you're not removing the root structure. So like you haven't actually cut the grass and created a scar, you have just trimmed the grass. So these are just some close-ups. You can see that there is lots of trim action. There's lots of scarring going on. Keep in mind these areas in here, I will come back to those when we talk about urchin grazing and some of our restoration success. The way we analyzed where to work, it was through a scarring intensity analysis, and basically these polygons were looked at and the severity of scarring was looked at, and we decided to basically focus on areas that were between moderate and severe scarring, focus our resources where it's the worst, and kind of hope the lighter scarring areas will recover naturally. This is a busy table, but what's important is that we identified almost 2.5 acres of propeller scars in St. Joseph Bay, so we could focus our efforts there. The average prop scar width was about 13 inches, and the average prop scar length was about 138 feet. Our longest scar out there is about 1,400 feet, or 1/4 mile, believe it or not. Some of ours are about 4 or 5 bags wide, so there is some very, very heavy scarring out there. You can see that the total acreages of our polygons is about 378 or 77 acres. So lots of ground to cover. As I mentioned, restoration plans were going to be developed for each bay based on the mapping of the prop scars. And we helped develop the plans on how they'd be treated, best management practices, things like that. 2 acres, as I said, were identified in St. Joe, so we saved the other plans for future use. And coming up this year, we're going to be working in St. Andrews using this plan, so we're excited about that. Sediment tubes, they are biodegradable socks. They look like a big cotton sock. They're about 8 inches by 3 feet long. They used a skid steer loader to load them up and bag them up, leave them out in the sun so they stay dry and don't mold over. If they tend to mold over, it jeopardizes the integrity of the bag, and they don't deploy right or they break down too soon in the water. Some of you that may be familiar might think these are a little light instead of being filled all the way. That was a decision on the move to adjust how much sand we were putting in the bag based on some lessons learned as we were deploying the bags. Some of the areas were too firm to have a full bag, so we were too high on the ambient grade. So we adjusted, filling the bags 3/4 of the way to be consistent everywhere, and we were able to meet ambient grade in most of our locations. So each day they would load up a barge, and our contractors would go out and mark the beginning of the end of the scars. They would drop piles of bags to try to focus on primary areas of the day, and then the guys would go out and manually place the bags into these scars. The width of the scars determine the number of bags. As I said, sometimes we were 3 and 4 bags wide. Sometimes in the softer sediments, there were bags placed on top of bags to be able to meet the ambient grade. So this is what a good deployed prop scar sediment tube bag looks like. You can see in these photos that as that bag biodegrades, the sand is going to level out and be pretty ambient. Some of these are a little taller because it's softer sediment, so we anticipate a little bit of subsidence. But so again, we want to be ambient, so the grass just grows in naturally once the bag breaks down. Bags take 4 to 6 months to break down normally, to where in our year 1 monitoring, we were still finding tops of the bags and the ropes that sort of tie those off, but the rest of the bags had disappeared. So most of this installation took place in 2020, and so between July and November, 44,000 sediment tubes were placed into 379 propeller scars, meeting our 2-acre requirement. You can see just how long some of these scars wind out, how much they cross over, and even there are 2 bags side by side. So lots of sediment tubes going in, lots of propeller scarring. To monitor, we monitor every scar. We go out every year and we monitor. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of people in the water. We use the Braun block head scale to monitor the seagrass. We use a 1/4 meter by 1/4 meter quadrat within the scar, and we identify seagrass and macroalgae species. We do total coverage as well for the whole plot. We also look at sediment type, blade height, the epiphytes. We record water quality. We take our scar measurements every 10 meters, and we do control measurements every 50 meters. So starting at 0, and then every 50 on the controls. We always start on the south and east end of the scar, just to be consistent, so we're always starting from the same end in our data. This is just an example again of our crew in the water, but this is in year 1, so you can see lots of tall grass and minimal to almost no growth growing in. But so we would swim along the scar, put the quad down at the 20 mark, and we would record data. Maybe there's a sprig growing in there, but so turtle grass is slow to respond. It's getting harder to find the scars. When I talked about ambient grade being met, this is a perfect example of prop scar restoration not working. So, as you can see, the sediment level is up high, and you still have the valley. Oh, I'm very sorry. And again, it's up high, so the valley continues to scour. If you look further down, there's more elevation, you start to see grass come back in. So again, we didn't meet the ambient grade, the grass doesn't grow in. When you do meet the ambient grade, you get all sorts of new growth like this, these awesome little shoots coming up. You can see how tall that grass is and all that new growth. This is a very sandy and firm area. This is a siltier, softer area. So again, it's about meeting the ambient level to have the grass grow back in. When things go really well, that's actually what it looks like. You can barely see any of the scar left. So we're getting lots of natural revegetation in areas that are working. One of the biggest problems we've had has been sea urchin grazing. As I mentioned, some of those areas in the south end, I'll fly back to the map real quick, I apologize. But so in some of these southern ends, so PSR 8 and PSR 6, where you can see lots of scarring existed, those areas have been completely denuded. There is no more grass, they are sandy flats. So areas where we put in 1,000-foot long, sediment tubes, et cetera, where there was grass around the scars, it is all gone. So our data has been skewed due to these, due to these urchins just forming massive fronts. Just if you think about it, 200 to 250 of these urchins can fit in a 5-gallon bucket. So when you think about the number of urchins that are in these hundreds of acres areas that are just mowing down the grass, there are millions of them. So we have lost, in year 1, 92 of our 123 scars we could not find were in those areas that were grazed by urchins. So pretty much 1/3 of our scars we treated have disappeared. So our data is very skewed by some of that. In year one, we did have some good response though. 10% of our scars did meet restoration levels, but since turtle grass is slow to grow, it's kind of expected. 50% of our scars did show growth though, so even with the ones that were missing, we still saw about half of our scars starting to respond. Because of the urchin grazing, we had some friends at Ecosphere Restoration Institute in Aquatech. They received a grant to plant 100 acres of seagrass around Florida. Because our project was permitted and planting is a corrective action in our project, just last summer we had 7 acres of grasses replanted into some of those scars exactly and some of those adjacent areas to try to kickstart some restoration. For their grant, 4,800 planting units. A planting unit is 9 shoots and 2 rhizomes. So they were put in, so 33,600 planting units were put into the bay to try to restore grass. And just as a fun fact, to try to restore an average acre of seagrass, it can be pretty expensive. So we got an extra almost $500,000 worth of seagrass restoration at no cost to us to try to help save this project. So in year 2 though, we're still seeing trouble, but more growth. We're definitely seeing scars improving to the score of 3, so we've doubled the percentage, so we're getting better. We're increasing on scars that are recovering, but we're finding more scars that are non-discernible, so we're still not recovering in those areas. We're also starting to find that we can't find some of the scars, so restoration is working to where it's all grass now, and that's fantastic, but that's a little slower. We're still seeing very, very slow recovery in those denuded areas though. So we're hopeful that with the new planting and some continued good response, we will see. So just as a summary, we did meet the 2 acres to treat, but we have not met our restoration goals. We're still a little behind in trying to get all the scars up to a 25 to 50% cover. We're doing okay, but we'd like to see more again if we didn't have the denuded areas. I'll talk about this buoy system in a minute. We started year 3 monitoring. We're very hopeful we can get to that coverage, but it might be wishful thinking. And we've done some survival of our planting units. They were doing well at 30 days, but we saw signs of turtle grazing, as well as the urchins that sort of moved in to eat fresh, beautiful plants. So the goal is actually this month, the guys are coming back up. We're going to replant 8 acres this month in 2 different trips to try to do some more because they've got to meet their grant deliverables, and we're more than happy to take free plants. The shallow seagrass buoy system was an educational outreach component of this project, basically to install buoys on these 30-foot long poles driven in to basically warn people of shallow areas. So in other words, keep them in these deep water channels. There's a lot of out-of-town boaters that come in, they don't know where they're going, and they could run aground and contribute to additional prop scarring. So we had kiosks put in, a boater guide developed, a map with all these coordinates available. And unfortunately, there are careless boaters who like to run into poles and drive over signs. Hurricane Michael decided to show up as well. And so in 2020, because of the cost to continue to replace everything, we decided to remove the system and sort of rethink the education and outreach component of it. Some things just don't work in some places. We've also tried to increase signage at boat ramps, partnered with FWC again, just our normal prop scar information. Sea Grant and University of Florida IFAS have the Scars Hurt program, which are cool signs, come in 2 pieces. It looks like scarring. It's a very cool outreach program. We've also done urchin roundups, which is just like it sounds. We have the public come out and help us collect urchins to relocate the urchins. The goal there is to collect them and to relocate them to relieve the grazing pressure in some of the more affected areas. Whether or not it was effective, we've had 6 roundups, relocated 55,000 urchins, but the urchin front has persisted for 5 years, and so we've just had continued damage. It's a great outreach event, but its effectiveness is kind of silly, but just being honest. But it is a great way to get the public involved. They get to do a restoration project themselves. They get to learn about it, and they get to see it. So it's a great outreach effort. We may continue to do those, but we're not sure. I'd be happy to answer any other questions. I know I flew through that, but there's a lot. So thank you.
All right, any questions for John? Yeah.
Yes, ecologically speaking, what do you think is the bigger threat, crop scarring or sea urchins? And are they related?
That's a great question. And prior to the urchins becoming a problem after Hurricane Michael, the reason we get these urchin fronts is a major disturbance typically happens. These things bloom. We've seen this in the Big Bend where they'll show up in these large numbers and disappear after a year or two. These have persisted like a bad red tide. They have stuck around. So it's a combination because as the urchins sort of mowed down those areas into the nudity, we have increased turbidity in the water. There's less sediment stabilization, and so that affects like seagrass being able to redevelop. But the continued lack of the protection of seagrass with the carelessness of boaters is also contributing to it. It's just pretty much scars we've treated, there are now new ones right next to it, or there's new ones every day. There's just so many careless boaters. So it's a combination, but for the past few years, because the urchin damage continued, it just makes that southern end of the bay chocolate milk sometimes with all the boats like zipping around down there. And so that really kind of stunts the ability of these seagrass to recover.
Have you monitored whether you're gaining or losing with the scars? Are you putting in more than you're restoring?
We are, so in other words, are we gaining seagrass back?
Right, net. I know you're gaining it back, but are you losing more than you're gaining?
You mean, like, are we getting more scars? Are we getting new scars faster than we're fixing?
Yes, and the answer to that is yes, is that we could only treat so many, and the bags went in 2020. It's been 4 years since 3.5 years since we've treated those. So if you think about the number of boaters that are out there every day, unfortunately, I think we are losing faster than we're
You need
gaining.
like missiles to pick up boats.
Flying sea urchin.
You know, landmines.
We're gonna put you in charge of that.
Yep. Go ahead.
Are there regulations on boaters that fix the problem?
Well, so there are some like rules, and there are fines that can be assessed onto careless boaters. The difficult thing for us as resource managers is we don't have any authority, so we have to call law enforcement. And for law enforcement to be able to ticket you or get someone in trouble, they have to catch that person in the act. Even if we film it, identify their boat, take a picture of their driver's license, doesn't matter. They have to be caught in the act by law enforcement, and so unfortunately, it kind of keeps our hands tied. We try to report it, we try to increase public education, that sort of way, but to enforce it is tough. If we were to try to create a motor exclusion zone, that's difficult to enforce too. We need law enforcement to be able to do that. And so it's a difficult thing. We're trying to come up with new ways to alert boaters, whether it's setting up electronic sensors to when you cross over, an alarm goes off on your GPS, or in a rental boat, it automatically cuts you down to idle speed. Some of that technology is being developed right now, but it's not ready to be implemented on a bigger scale just yet. That was my question. Any other questions? In the back. Say that louder, please.
Do you have a cost per cubic foot or per acre for restoration?
The cost per acre on the high end is about $66,000 per acre. If you were to look at all, that's just the average cost. So however many acres we've restored. So 2 linear acres doesn't sound like that much because it's only 2 acres. But for all the sediment tubes and all that stuff, those numbers I don't know off the top of my head exactly what it all costs. I think overall we spent on this project $1.5 million or something like that for just the 2 acres.
It's at ambient level, or if you have to build up this thing.
Yes. Any other questions? If you have more, ask me.
Thank you, John. We're gonna go ahead and go into a 20-minute break now, so if everyone could be back at 3:10, and we'll jump into session 4, which is funding opportunities.
So our last session of the day, we wanted to take advantage of some of the folks that we knew were going to be in the room to talk about available funding through the state, specifically DEP. And it's not by any means exhaustive list of DEP funding. There's actually a whole website for that if you're really interested. But just a sampling related to restoration. And then also to talk about some of the opportunities through NOAA. And so we're going to have a couple presentations, and then I'm going to ask the ladies to come up here and answer some questions from you guys. So be thinking of some questions as we go along. And then we have some other kind of leading questions if we go silent kind of thing. But this is really the benefit of the room, educational. Hopefully you guys will learn about some new opportunities and maybe be looking around at maybe some potential future partnerships that could be funded through these opportunities. So our first presenter today is Krista Slyter. Krista is from DEP's Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection. She is the administrator of the Planning and Policy for the Resilient Florida Program. I believe you're good to go.
Awesome. Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I'm going to just dive right in, and this was intended to be a much larger presentation about our whole program, but because this is a funding-focused panel, I'm going to do my best to focus predominantly on where we can give you money. That's what's important. All right, so I can't start without actually going through a little bit of the history of the Resilient Florida program. We are a baby program. We are less than 3 years old. We're coming towards the end of our 3rd year. We were created by the Always Ready bill in 2021, and that was the legislature's unanimous decision to acknowledge that Florida is vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding and the potential impacts of more severe storms in the future. And that in order to address these challenges, we had to work with communities so that they could adapt their critical and regionally significant assets. We needed to have a statewide vision for this, and that includes both a coastal component and an inland component, when prior it was just coastal. And then we also need to provide state resources in the form of a statewide data set and a vulnerability assessment. Since then, and I'm going to glaze over legislative changes since then, there's been some every year. So in 2022, there was some finagling of definitions, a little bit of adjustments to eligibility, entities, and due dates. We were able to provide some more support for planning efforts in small communities. And then the biggest thing in this is that the statewide resilience plan, which I'm going to talk about a lot more later, it switched the funding from no more than $100 million in any year to at least $100 million in a year. And then last year, we had a couple different changes through House Bill 111. The first one is just a couple different types of new planning grants that we are able to offer and fund. And then also some changes to something called the Sea Level Impact Projection Study, commonly called the SLIP study, which is required for coastal construction if the state is financing it. And a shameless plug, we're in rulemaking for the SLIP-related updates right now. If you're interested and have public comments, we're in the middle of a public commenting period, and the information can be found on the website. And then this year, we have a lot of proposed changes through a suite of bills. This is just some of the highlights. We are still in legislative session, so none of these are finalized, but just a kind of sneak peek of things that may come. Things like adjusting definitions, again, a new potential planning grant type, updates to requirements for local vulnerability assessments, as well as the statewide assessment that we're currently working on. And then some updates to eligibility requirements for the statewide resilience plan. And then some clarification on activities that are allowed for regional resilience entity funding. Again, another funding source that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. All right, so the Resilient Florida program has 5 different components. 3 of these are funding based and 2 of them are more data and information based. I'm going to touch on all of them through the presentation, but again, I'm going to try and focus more on the funding than the others. So regional resilience entities. The question I get asked most often is, what is one? So the statute tells us that a regional resilience entity is something that is established by local governments that work to plan for communities' flooding resilience and intergovernmental solutions for those, for that flood resilience. So in practice, that's generally been regional planning councils or RPCs, but it doesn't have to be an RPC. So if you have in mind another organization that might fit that bill, we might have funding available for them, and that's really important because the locals are the ones who know about those organizations most readily. So the things that we can fund for those entities are technical assistance for local governments, coordinating multi-jurisdictional vulnerability assessments. That's especially important in areas with really small municipalities that might not have the resources to do this on their own, even with our funding. And then they can also help develop project proposals for planning grants or for implementation projects long-term. All right, so the Resilient Florida Grant Program, this is what we call our planning grants. So this is how people are identifying what vulnerabilities to flooding are in their community. Oh, my notes are skipping a slide. So this is predominantly to fund vulnerability assessments. We're also able to fund adaptation and resilience plans, comprehensive plan amendments, and we're required to help with peril of flood compliance if a community is not already in compliance. For the majority of our planning grants, counties and municipalities are the eligible entities, but there is a new category since last year where water management districts are able to address data gaps identified by the Florida Flood Hub. And we were actually able to, for the first time this year, able to fund some of those data acquisition type projects. And these planning grants are fully funded by the department. All right, so what do we do with the data that we get out of these local vulnerability assessments? They go into the statewide data set. But we didn't want to start just with the local vulnerability assessments. We wanted to do the legwork and compile everything that we could find. So we actually worked with Balmoral to compile all the data sets out there. We did call for information from counties and municipalities, other local governments, state, local, and federal sources. And we have now 3.3 million points, polygons, and lines for critical assets in the state of Florida. This is coordinated with the Florida Flood Hub. They reviewed the data and they're also hosting the data for us. And we're going to use this data to do the statewide vulnerability assessment, and that is going to be done by the end of June this year. All right, so this is a slide that could be a presentation in and of itself. So this is a slide about our statewide resilience plan. That's really the compilation of projects that are submitted for implementation funds in any given year and are eligible for those funds. That eligibility is laid out in our statute, but essentially it needs to be a project that addresses a risk of flooding or sea level rise. So it kind of has to be a boots on the ground mitigation project. Local governments like counties and municipalities are eligible, but a lot of special districts are also eligible for these funds. And these projects are funded with a 50% match requirement unless a community is financially disadvantaged. Small community and Franklin and Gulf County both fit that bill currently. So they would be waived from any match requirement and we would be fully funding projects. So people submit projects, communities submit projects. We got, I think, 270 last year. How do we decide what to fund? The legislature made that pretty easy for us and they put a tiered scoring criteria system in the statute that we follow. So we've got kind of this pyramid visual here to show those tiers. We also kind of elaborated on them and gave more detail on what communities needed to provide in order to score well in a Rule 62S-8, Florida Administrative Code. But the big thing I want to take away from this slide is there are multiple scoring criteria that address nature-based solutions and habitat enhancement, where projects such as those get points when other projects would not. And so that's having those components in your project actually really helps score better and therefore rank better in the plan and increase chances of funding. So this actually is a slide that shows some of the projects that were done prior to the Resilient Florida program. I included this because you can see that prior to the Resilient Florida program, there were actually some projects in this area. Right now, Resilient Florida funding isn't funding any nature-based solutions projects in this area, which we are hoping to change. But I wanted to go ahead and highlight that DEP in the state of Florida has put funds into this area in the past, as we've heard from other presentations today as well. And then I realized Pensacola Bay is not the area we're focusing on, but as I mentioned, we don't actually have any Resilient Florida nature-based solution funds in this area right now. So I did want to highlight the type of project that we are funding. This is actually a Pensacola Bay project. It's a $10.3 million project with a 50% DEP cost share. And this was funded beginning of July 1st of 2024. So it's just, 2023, sorry. So it's just kind of getting off the ground. So this is over in Sherman Inlet and White Island. It's going to reestablish almost 35 acres of sandy shoreline and dunes, establish over 11 acres of oyster reef breakwaters, and have natural recruitment for up to 45 acres of submerged aquatic vegetation. And then it's also going to construct some emergent marsh platforms, and that will provide habitat for environmentally, commercially, and recreationally important species. So this is the type of project where if it was proposed for this area, it could potentially get funding in the state plan in the future. So our program does do more than just give out money. So I wanted to highlight a little bit of those things as well. We're working on a living shoreline suitability model for the entire state. We're working on that with researchers from UCF, and that's going to build upon some localized models that other researchers have done in Florida. We're also working on updating the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, which is what it sounds like. It's how you go from identifying what is vulnerable, figuring out what to do about it, and figuring out how to get the funds to do something about it. We're constantly updating our application resources, especially as I mentioned, we've had statutory changes every year. So we want to provide the best resources that we can for the public because we want applicants to be successful. And then each year we have a summer webinar series. We're still working on finalizing the topics for that this year, but I know that we'll have one on the statewide vulnerability assessment once it's completed, and we'll also have one on the SLIP study updates that are effective on July 1st. And in the vein of wanting our applicants to be successful, we really pride ourselves on our application assistance. We actually have a pre-application period from April 1st to June 15th that we started last year. And then in that time and throughout the application period through September 1st, we do virtual office hours twice a week where applicants or just people interested in the program can join a Teams meeting that's on our website, and we'll have staff on the call automatically. We do a lot of emails from applicants requesting feedback on proposals, requesting meetings. We dedicate a significant amount of our staff time during that time period to this pre-application and application assistance. And then last year we were able to do in-person office hours around the state. We went to 7 different DEP district offices in July and August, which is during the application period, and helps people with everything from I can't get my login to the application site to work to is this a good project? Should I even put time into it? And then we were able to sit down and actually help people submit applications as well. So we really pride ourselves on that assistance. We're finalizing the plan for that this year, but come April 1st, we will be doing virtual office hours. It's already on my calendar. So if you have any questions about the program, certainly reach out to me or keep an eye on our website for those application resources. Thank you. And I assume we'll be saving questions for the panel, but my contact information is here as well.
Okay, our next speaker is Heidi Stiller. Heidi is the South Regional Director of the Office for Coastal Management within NOAA. I should start from the top, like do the whole one down. It's like a D too. Like, so, thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us today. And thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate you sticking around. The Apalachicola Reserve actually hosted me for 4 years quite some time ago now, and I'm always grateful. That was really part of my best years in Florida, so it's really nice to be back. Amazing to hear about the work that all of you were doing, so it's been a treat to be here. Jenna asked me to speak about NOAA's funding opportunities, and I will focus on restoration-related things mostly. I also will mention a couple of other federal funding opportunities outside of NOAA just because they're open right now, so I wanted to let you know about those. So starting really big picture, this is sort of like Sarah's talk, sort of starting at the high level about the different buckets. So both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and then the Inflation Reduction Act provided significant funding to NOAA. And again, some of this is going to, research and facilities and things like that on the NOAA side, but a lot of the money is rolling out the door and a lot of it is for conservation, restoration, land acquisition projects, which is really exciting. Backing up sort of to look at, this is the equivalent of the buckets, right? We always talk about all the buckets under restore and post deep water. There are a lot of buckets within this funding. This highlights the ones that my office, the Office for Coastal Management, is involved with. And I'll share a PDF of this afterwards so you can go back and look at all of these if you're curious. But I'm going to touch on some of these that you see highlighted. So our office works really closely with the state coastal zone management programs and with the system of national estuarine research reserves. And so there is a significant chunk of funding to support work by these two programs. I will mention that in the case of the coastal zone management programs, that funding doesn't necessarily have to be administered by the CZM program. They do have to support it and endorse the project, but it can actually be managed and run by another entity. And again, the project types that this is aimed at supporting is restoration, restoration planning, acquisition, engineering and design, so the full range. So year one is complete in terms of we ran the competition and awarded the projects. We did have some great year one projects in the Gulf of Mexico. 3 were conservation, so land acquisition projects, a couple of restoration efforts, including one at Brucker Bay Research Reserve to the south of us, and 1 planning project. Year 2 is underway right now. We've been reviewing full proposals. And again, we had really strong participation from across the Gulf, from both the CZM programs and the reserves. And then looking forward, we'll probably run 2 more competitions with the remainder of this funding. So if you have a good project idea, connect with the coastal program or your local reserve. And then National Coastal Resilience Fund, we already heard about this funding source. Rick talked about NCRF is one of the funding sources for the Franklin 98 project. And I think I heard it mentioned in one of the others as well. But this is a great funding source. And this is the 3rd year, I believe, where it's been sort of ramped up by BIL and IRA funding. There's standing funding of about $30 million a year, but right now there's $140 million a year. And it's just a whole lot easier than applying for a federal grant. So if you haven't looked at the National Coastal Resilience Fund before, I would definitely urge you to do that. The trick with this one is that you have to be able to show that in addition to getting habitat and wildlife benefits, you're also getting some community resilience benefits. So Franklin 98 is a great example where you have a piece of public infrastructure, the road, right, that is super critical for community resilience. It's a key evacuation route, all the things, right? So you have to have some community resilience tie. And in the next slide, I've got some of the deadlines for this most recent year. They've got webinars coming up next week. Pre-proposals are due April 10th, and those pre-proposals are easy. They're like 5 pages. So if you're not quite sure, it's easy to put in a pre-proposal, and then you can consider if you really want to go through a full proposal. And again, much easier than a federal grant proposal. Invite only for full proposals, but those will be due in July, and then they announce those every year around November. Just the priorities, again, it's got to have both that wildlife habitat benefit and the community resilience piece. One of the other great things about NCRF funding is that it can support projects at all different phases. So if you're just starting to figure out what you want to do, or if you're doing community engagement to figure out where do we want to deploy nature-based solutions in our area, that can be a capacity building and planning grant. If you're ready to start getting some design together, assess your sites, there's a category for that. And then of course there's other categories for design permitting and then for actual implementation. And NCRF is administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So NOAA gets the money, we send it over to NIFWF, they run the competition. They really like pipeline projects. So if you can get in and then you submit for your next phase, those seem to do well. All right, so stepping away from my office, the National Marine Fisheries Service, so the fish side of NOAA, also got extensive funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and then the Inflation Reduction Act. So lots of money for habitat restoration. These are the different competitions that fisheries has been running. Some of them are very specific to fish passage. Transformational habitat restoration, that's the big one and where most of the dollars are. That's a funding source that could support a lot of the sorts of work that you heard presented on today. And then they held back a percentage, I think it was 10 million, don't quote me on that, to specifically try to support restoration work that involves tribes and other underserved communities. And I will say that that's a category where they're really allowing some pretty innovative work. So you can Google and find some of the types of things that they funded, but that's a neat one. So round one, this is just a map that shows you all the different places where things were funded. And one of the other things that was really great is a lot of new awardees who haven't gotten a grant before from Office of Habitat Conservation within Fisheries, so that was exciting to see. Again, they're in round two, just as we are, so they are reviewing proposals right now as we speak. There will be a round three. I reached out to my fisheries colleague right before I came and I said, do you know when? And she said, I don't. So I can't tell you when round three will be. It might be in 2025, but they might wait until 2026, trying to figure out whether it makes sense to bundle a couple of years together or not. I wanted to mention some other in-process funding competitions that maybe can support restoration or that might include restoration components. This is the big one that my office is administering, the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. Did any of you put in a letter of intent or were involved in a letter of intent? I think Joel was involved in a letter of intent. We were talking about that. I see another hand. So this is a funding stream that's intended to support projects that foster regional collaboration, deliver measurable risk reduction, that can be a hard one because you have to be able to measure it, really foster equity and inclusion, and then also build enduring capacity so the work will carry on after the life of the grant. We thought we might get 200, maybe 300 letters of intent. We got 869. We have 575 million and we got 16 billion in proposals. So I want to let you know that we are working really hard right now to document that and to prepare congressional outreach materials that say, here's the demand for this sort of funding and the need for this sort of funding. So we will be attempting to make the case that they should keep this funding stream going. Really strong participation from the Gulf of Mexico region. We are, again, reviewing full proposals right now, and award should be announced this summer. There's two tracks for the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. The first track is $1 million to $2 million, and that's really for planning and collaboration, sort of building a regional resilience collaborative type work. But track two is the big dollars, that's 15 to 75 million for implementation. And as you can see here, if you look at the sorts of things that can be funded, it can include restoration, acquisition, and we did get strong proposals from the Gulf of Mexico region that did involve these sorts of components. So keep an eye out for what ends up getting funded with this particular funding stream. Another one I wanted to mention is the Climate Ready Workforce opportunity. This is something that the Sea Grant Office and the Climate Program Office are administering, but looking to fund workforce development. And again, that might be development of natural resource restoration jobs, for example. So things like the Conservation Corps that we heard a lot about today. And those proposals were also just recently due. Marine debris, again, these have closed, but should be funding more really good marine debris work in our region. All right, jumping over to other federal opportunities beyond NOAA. One I wanted to highlight in particular is EPA's community change grants. There's $2 billion for these, so there's a lot of funding available. And they're doing something really innovative this time. They're doing rolling applications. So you can put in an application now and then get feedback on it and submit it again. And that is going to go on between now and November. These are really designed to have a strong environmental justice, climate equity focus. So if there's work that involves underserved communities or working with tribes, I definitely urge you to check out this funding opportunity. There's lots of information online about those community change grants, and EPA is doing webinars and all those sorts of things right now. A few other sources are worth mentioning. The federal family is really sort of tuned in, I would say, to nature-based solutions. And you're starting to see nature-based solutions guides from FEMA and from the Federal Highway Administration, agencies that haven't sort of traditionally been playing in this space, really are starting to see the value, and they are making investments. FEMA's big one is the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And I would say that if you're interested in knowing more about this funding source, talk to FDEM, Florida Division of Emergency Management folks, because they run the show for Florida, right? So local projects flow up to the state, and then the state sends them off to FEMA, but good potential to support nature-based solutions type work. And then within Department of Transportation, they're another agency that gets gobs of money compared to NOAA. There's also a new appreciation for and interest in funding nature-based solutions. The Federal Highway Administration is just one piece of DOT, but they were sort of early adopters and have been funding some really good nature-based solutions work. If you go online, there's a list of all the federal funding opportunities for green infrastructure. I brought a copy of the list if you want to look at it, but you can also Google it and find it very quickly. I find it a little bit overwhelming. There's got to be 50 on that list, but there are a lot of emerging opportunities from other feds too. And then this one I had to mention just because it just came out. Some of you probably have this in your inbox right now. Again, it's year 3, and again, it's a situation where the feds get the money, they turn it over to the National Fish and Wildlife Fund to administer. DOD, Department of Interior, and Department of Ag are contributors for this one. But again, this can support the sort of work that we heard about today, and the $119 million in this third round. The REPI program within Department of Defense is contributing funding to this, and they're really interested in funding work not just on military installations, but in the surrounding area. That's been part of funding some of the work at Tyndall. And that's it for me. One shameless plug for new data that we have. We're always putting out new stuff on Digital Coast, but we just released high resolution land cover for the entire state of Florida. The initial data product includes 3 categories. So you can get water bodies, impervious, and canopy. And the quality of the data is, we used to do 30 meters, so going to 1 meter is a really big jump for us. I can see the tree in my backyard that I had to cut down after the last hurricane, which is very sad, but it's still there in the imagery. So it's really high res, and it'll be really useful for, flood mitigation planning and for looking at heat islands and things like that. And I won't take questions, I guess, because we're going to do panel, right? Okay.
All right, so at this point, I was just gonna open it up for questions, general questions from the audience for any of our speakers this afternoon. I see one. Oh, hey Steve, go ahead.
Okay, a lot of the programs that I heard talked about dealt with sort of the climate extremes that we're gonna be seeing coming from climate change. But most of them seem to focus towards the flooding side and the sea level rise side. But on the other side of the coin, we have droughts. And Apalachicola Bay could be affected by more extreme droughts, management of our reservoir systems, more extreme droughts, and so on. There are grant programs to deal with that side.
You wanna tackle that one?
I'll start. Okay. So very true. And the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge was designed to be any climate hazard. So it could have been heat, drought, wildfire. et cetera. It is true that a lot of the funding is sort of targeted towards flooding type risk on the NOAA side. But there's lots of other federal funding, I will say, under IRA and BIL that is more expansive across climate hazards.
We'll deal with the ecological side. So we're gonna deal more with community.
I would say that yes, certainly that would have been eligible for the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. I'm not as familiar with other federal funding that deals with drought and wildfire type things, just because it's not my area, but I suspect there's funding for that.
Department of Ag,
Yeah,
because they're crops. Of course,
For the benefit of the recording, could I recommend you repeat the question before responding or summarize the question before responding?
thank you, will do.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Jeff.
Hi Heidi, I'm Kent Wimmer, I'm the coordinator of the Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape. The America the Beautiful, I was just on a webinar, so I came in late. They have $5 million set aside for projects within Sentinel Landscape, so really, any project in Northwest Florida is gonna get a step up, at least be more competitive for, those kind of projects. And also, NIFWIS, National Coastal Resilience Fund, their contractors, Throw Environmental, you're gonna be in Panama City next Tuesday. They asked me to schedule some time to meet with potential applicants, folks that want to discuss projects. I have 3 slots open. If you want to make a presentation, if you want to just talk, meet face to face with NIFWIS consultants for National Coastal Resilience, FSU's Panama City campus, let me know. I have 3 slots open to make appointments if you want to talk to actually the guys and evaluate these projects. So.
And Ken, you are gonna hear.
Yeah, I'm making a presentation tomorrow,
Yes.
but in the context of your presentation, I just wanted to announce that since we have a big audience.
Folks wanna think about that and get back to you.
Yeah, Kent, thank you for sharing. So Throw is a consultant to NIFWIF, right?
Yes.
And so they help folks during the proposal development idea generation process. They don't actually review proposals, but they help at this stage. So it's a great opportunity if they're gonna be in Panama City. You can also reach out to them online. They have a website with a point of contact for each region, and you can also reach to me and I can connect you to NIFWIF. So, but it's great to know about that near-term opportunity. Excellent.
a lot of these programs require match or prefer match. Could you just describe some of the kind of creative match opportunities that you've seen applicants use? Because there's not always good old cash around. Any particular, what are people using as match that's out of the box?
Well, I'll just come out the gate and say that for Restore, there is not a match requirement, although we do ask applicants to supply leveraging information. It helps,
Same,
it doesn't
that's
hurt.
the-
Yeah, but there's not a requirement, and so then I'll just defer to my colleague at Resilient Florida.
Yes, so Resilient Florida implementation projects, they do have a 50% match unless that they meet a waiver requirement. So a lot of communities don't meet that. Some of the creative ways.
Are they allowed to do pre-award costs as match, or does it have to be tied to the new project?
They have to be project related, and they might be able to date back to the beginning of the program depending on the specific match. We really look at those case by case because it can be complicated. It's also harder to match like a state fund appropriation to our program as well. So that's part of our pre-application. We like going over those in advance. Some of the stuff we've seen that maybe not be especially creative, but if a project is already partially designed, they can use the money that they spent on that design as part of their match. Equipment costs, if they already own the equipment that needs to be and they won't have to rent anymore, things like that. And then one of the ones that we've seen is if a critical structure has to be relocated, if they choose not to harden it, they can potentially use the value of that land or the cost that they bought it for, depending on when they bought it, things like that.
Yeah, and I will chime in, you know, a lot of the things I mentioned don't require match because IRA doesn't require it. So NCRF, for example, there's no match requirement. Again, NIFWIF is interested in seeing what you might be able to leverage. I think the creative things I've seen have been mostly around like people's time and equipment, as you said, right? But it could also be volunteer time, so it's always important to document your volunteer time because you can count that as match. Or if you have a boat captain who's driving you around, like all of that person's time and the gas, you know, all the things. There are a couple, sometimes you can use federal money as match. The Housing and Urban Development, HUD, their Community Development Block Grant Funding, CDBG, that can be used. And it's once it gets to the state, then it's considered not federal anymore. So it can be used as match to federal funding, which is a neat little trick that a lot of folks don't know about. And some of the REPI DOD money can be used that way too.
Questions?
I had a quick question for you, Heidi, about the 1 meter land cover data. Is that available starting now and going forward, or is there some historical time series of that?
So it's part of our coastal change analysis program, CCAP data. And right now, all of the historical data is 30 meter, right? And so we're trying to make the transition to 1 meter. And so this initially, you won't be able to look back, right? Because it's just the first time we're doing this 1 meter product. But going forward, the idea is to repeat the 1 meter product so that you can do that comparison. Right now, it's just those 3 categories, but the hope is to build it out to the full CCAP classification, which is like 24 or 25, so different types of wetlands. And so it's coming. Florida's fortunate that Florida defines the entire state as the coastal zone, so the whole state got covered with this acquisition. Yeah, and it's, if you digital coast high resolution land cover, you'll find it.
Heidi, something that, oh, sorry, question? I saw
one in the back.
Go ahead.
So you might not, I don't know if you have an answer here, but with these grants, I know like having a federal grant can be pretty onerous, a lot of expectations, a lot of overhead having it. Is there any effort, particularly on the federal side, with the NIFWIF, whatever, to try to make that whole process of getting, maintaining, reporting on grants simpler for folks, or is that?
Yes, but it's not enough. So the question was, are there efforts to try and simplify the federal grant process? And I will say that I feel as if folks are trying every day to make it better, but it is an uphill road. And it's not just the application process, it's once you get it, then administering it is also a bear, right? So I think that, you know, certainly for our office, we try and provide as much technical assistance as we can. And I think that you'll see multiple federal agencies sending money over to NIFWIF, right? And their process is less onerous. So that's one mechanism that I think has been successful, but it's something that we just have to continue to chip away at. So continue to tell decision makers that it should be easier. And this rolling grant thing that EPA is trying, that's the first time I've seen that. And they're also starting to consider different ways that you could apply because they want to really make it much more accessible for underserved communities. So they're starting to talk about like video submissions. So evolution is coming sort of in fits and starts. So. Did you have a question?
Something you said, kind of triggered in my mind something I was going to ask Krista about. You were talking about pipeline projects, and I was curious if you, in the Resilient Florida program, are kind of starting to see this progression of, like, a municipality or a city or county does a planning grant, and then or the vulnerability assessment, and then an adaptation action plan, and then, you know, is it becoming more sequential? Are you guys seeing that? Or is it still kind of, we're still trying to go through those first steps first and we're not quite to that point?
I think we're just not quite there yet. So we are seeing some completed vulnerability assessments now, but those are really just starting to roll in. We're just coming to the end of our first planning grant cycle, where those products are coming to us. I will say that if you have previous state involvement in a project, that does get you points in the scoring criteria for implementation projects. So that is a potential avenue where it might increase the likelihood of funding for an implementation project if they've worked on that project with state funds in the past. But we're not quite there in seeing that whole kind of cradle to grave aspect of the projects quite yet.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to maybe, if you're in on those planning efforts, to kind of front load a little bit, maybe future.
So we can, and this is something that I don't even think I touched on in the presentation. One of the changes last year, perhaps, to the planning grants was we can actually pay for 100% of pre-construction activities for small communities. That's a municipality that's less than 10,000 or a county that's less than 50,000. So those pre-construction activities could be permitting, design, all of those type of activities. So that would be a way where if they have an identified risk to a critical asset, where they could kind of chip away at it with different funding pots over time, with less municipal or county output of funds.
And Jenna, I'll just add for Deepwater Horizon projects, there are opportunities for funding to occur at different stages of the project between the funding streams and even between the buckets of restore funding. And even some like the Pensacola Bay Living Shoreline project that Krista showed has Deepwater Horizon funding, and some of the implementation will be funded through Resilient Florida. So it's taken a long time to get projects to that point where they are able to pipeline, so to speak, but they are starting to do that, I think, just organically.
Yeah, thank you all very much for a boatload of money out there. There's a lot of processes out there, different grants. Is there a website, an app or something where you can go to and say, you know, I'm looking at resilience, I'm looking at these aspects, and it'll pop up what grants are available, which grants actually meet your needs, what you're looking at, and you can go to them that link. Instead of knowing ahead of time what grant you have to go to or what agency you have to go to, and then read through what that is. Is there a way to match up your need online with something? With a fund?
No. So to repeat, so the question was whether there's a good way to find your way to the right funding stream, right? And so if there's some sort of searchable website where you could say, I want to do this, and it would say, okay, these are the 5 things. There isn't, I haven't seen anything like that. I think there are some compilations of opportunities out there. There's several websites that have nature-based solutions opportunities, for example. I know the White House put out guides to bipartisan infrastructure law funding and then IRA funding, but they're overwhelming, right? So my advice is always to try to find other people that are doing the sort of thing that you want to do and ask them how they paid for it.
So I'll also add to that one, I love the idea because it would save me a lot of time on the phone with people asking if our program is a good fit for them. But I do want to put in a plug for Protecting Florida Together. It's a website where at least DEP grant resources are in one place. So that's going to be not necessarily resilient specific, but it's going to be other parts of the agency as well. So that's a really great resource for DEP available grant funds and protecting Florida together. You're welcome.
There's a lot of private land in this watershed. Defenders of Wildlife actually produced that kind of tool you're looking for, for private lands. It's oriented towards land trust. And so there is a tool, that lists all the programs that kind of does this crosswalk. You're going to do this, and this is the these are the grant programs. And so there's that kind of tool. And then also, Department of Defense REPI website actually has a very good reference for all these various funding tools, programs that could be used for land conservation, stewardship, restoration, all that good stuff. So there are several places you can turn. So it's like repi.mil and defenders.org. You can look those up.
And I thought you were going to put in a plug for your own Northwest Florida Regional. Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape mailing list, because can't you share 90% of the available opportunities that are relevant to the kind of things that this group was talking about today, monthly or as they come up?
I just said that in charge.
Very helpful.
And I'll mention too, the Florida Climate Institute. You can sign up for their newsletter, and they send out a list of all the climate related funding opportunities. That's a really extensive list, and it covers some of the other hazards that you were asking about. Dan?
So I think my question is there a way to use your money to leverage a federal agency into doing things better? And I'm going to be a little more specific, so I can just say the Corps of Engineers was spoiling all over the floodplain and, causing sedimentation in the marshes and stuff. That if we put in a project that we would at least get it somewhat getting the nod as a potential, but then the Corps would have to use the funding because it's their operations that's doing it. Does that make sense?
I think so. So Dan, I think you were asking whether a third party could propose a project, but it would actually be the Corps that implements the project.
I think
Yeah, and I don't think that's possible, at least with the funding streams that I talked about so far, because we're not allowed to give the money to another Fed, right? So it can't go to another part of NOAA, and it can't go to another federal agency. I guess what I might recommend though is maybe talk to the Florida Silver Jackets program. So Silver Jackets is a program that the Army Corps runs in various states. Florida has a program that I would say was pretty inland focused for a while, but in just the last 2 years, they've gotten pretty interested in coastal work. They just did a really great story map that's all about living shorelines in Florida. It's got good examples, it's got funding information, it's got permit information, like what you need to do to get your DEP permit, what you need to get a Army Corps permit. And they do technical assistance type work. I would maybe chat with somebody with the Silver Jackets program. I can send you an email with some contacts and see if they have suggestions.
The Corps has a particular funding program, I think it's section 1135, where if they kind of broke something in the past, there's money available to have them come back and try to fix it. That's different than they do first. Yeah, that's another pot.
Thank you.
Somewhat linked to that, and some fish passage discussions we've had, we've gotten at least a tentative yes from NOAA and the course, like if there was fish passage money, it could be used as the local match requirement for a core project, and so it's like, there's no like forcing anybody to do anything, but that could possibly be used as a match source. So that's heading the direction you're asking, I think.
That's a very encouraging sign. I know.
I had a couple more quick questions. Krista, I don't know if you covered this in your presentation, but the Resilient Florida program is not just about coast, it's the entirety of the state of Florida. You guys include every county in the state, not just
Correct.
coastal counties.
Yes, and that is one of the big differences between us and our predecessor program. We have both funds available and projects in all counties available. And our enabling legislation is very clear that it's not just sea level rise that we're, dealing with. It's intensified rainfall events, all things like that. So it is, yes, inland is, please submit projects. And call me if you need help with your application.
And then one more quick question for Sarah. So you kind of mentioned a little bit forward-looking for the next kind of rounds of funding available. Where can some agency folks, NGOs, public intersect with what you guys are creating or coming up with for the next round of funding?
Yeah, great question. So the NIFWIF GEBF funding is ramping down. We're approaching that 2.544 million. But as far as NERDA goes, we're actually, the way that NERDA works post 2016 settlement is that the trustees come together and they draft a restoration plan and release that to the public. Prior to this restoration plan, we solicited projects. We did that in late 2022, and we spent the spring of 2023 screening project ideas to put together, they're not called projects, to put together alternatives for this draft restoration plan. So we're on about a every 3 years or so schedule for that. So there's a reason for that. I mentioned that funding and restore funding both come every year. There are deposits, and we just wait for those trust funds to build up to an amount that is worth kind of doing these restoration planning efforts and dispersing the money. So going to get information for NERDA, you can go to gulfspillrestoration.com or .gov, sorry, that's a website operated by NOAA. NOAA is one of the Florida TIG trustees. So gulfspillrestoration.gov. For restore, similarly, we're on a every 3 years-ish or so track. We develop what's called funded priorities lists, and unlike NERDA, which is confined to the Florida TIG restoration area, restore for bucket 2 is Gulf-wide. I'm not going to talk about the other buckets. So we are actually, Florida is a member of the Restore Council, and the Restore Council right now is starting their plans for their funded priorities list 4. They're expected to complete that in 2026. So there will probably be a solicitation sometime after April 2026. After our April 2026 deposit, the funds are there. They get awarded to Florida as the member of Restore Council, and then Florida starts to solicit project ideas for their programs that they've developed for Restore. So restorethegulf.gov is Restore Council's website that they do email blasts from. You can sign up to get all that information. And of course, you can come to DEP's Deepwater Horizon website, and we have links to all that stuff. Should have told you that first. But any questions, follow up?
No question, just to follow up that if you're looking to apply for Deepwater Horizon funding, contact your state agencies and get familiar with the people who are in charge of, looking at projects, because they're very helpful in down the road when the funding comes in to to understanding what it is you want to accomplish and tailoring.
Thanks.
Do the county still have money or is that money spent?
The counties still have money, so in some of the other buckets, coastal counties received money directly, and in another bucket, there's a consortium of counties that receive funding and kind of divvy that up in a state expenditure plan, so. Yeah.
Any last questions? Any other comments from the panel? I very much appreciate you guys presenting and sharing all of this information. I think you guys all have their contact information or know where to go if you need more information. So thank you very much. So that is it for today. Thank you everyone for sticking around, and we will start up again tomorrow with some coffee and maybe some breakfast snacks about 8:30, and then start in about 9 o'clock. Tomorrow's focus is going to be on partnerships within the watershed. So the first session will be on some different groups that are operating within the watershed and outside the watershed, including us. And then the second session will focus in on our watershed coordination blueprint project that we're working with the Balmoral group on. So hope you guys can attend tomorrow. The recording for today will be, you will be notified if you registered for the symposium that the recording is available, and we'll have that out as soon as possible. And yes, and
will presentations be made available? On the recording.
Just I'm looking at Kennedy's like.
We can.
Yes. We might do this on demand. Yeah, you just contact us. I think if that's all right with everybody. And I think that's it. Anita, did I forget anything? Thank you again, everyone.